Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give a presentation on the intuitive mind, and particularly from Sri Aurobindo's point of view. Intuition is a term that expresses a fairly common experience of an idea seeming to come into our mind from some source of greater wisdom or creativity. This common experience is a confirmation of sorts of certain basic tenets of Sri Aurobindo's spiritual philosophy, because it suggests, first, that there exists a greater wisdom and source of knowledge beyond our everyday human mind, and secondly, that this higher wisdom is in relation and contact with us, and we can open to and receive from its store of knowledge. In Sri Aurobindo's view, the source of all knowledge is indeed beyond the mind, in what he terms the supermind, a consciousness which we might characterize by more suggestive terms such as divine knowledge and power. Sri Aurobindo describes supermind with such characteristics as omniscient, omnipotent, and knowledge by identity. He also says it is the eternal knowledge and will of the Ishvara, with the term Ishvara defined in his various writings as the Lord, Master, the Divine, or God. Although the ultimate goal of Sri Aurobindo's yoga is to ascend to this supramental plane of consciousness and to bring its knowledge and power down to transform our life here, this cannot occur until many beginning and intermediate steps are taken. I will be discussing some of these steps and stages, but I want to focus on the nature and development of the intuitive mind, as this is one of the main highways leading towards the supermind. Sri Aurobindo has explained that above the ordinary intellect, there are several basic planes of consciousness: the higher mind, the illumined mind, intuition, overmind, and above that, the supermind, which is a radically different type of consciousness. We can potentially receive intuitions from any of these planes of consciousness, though the overmind and supermind are divine planes and beyond the scope of most human beings. Besides these higher levels of consciousness above the normal intellect, there are also inner domains of consciousness: the inner mind, the inner vital, the inner subtle physical, and the inmost psychic consciousness. Intuitions can also come from these inner domains, though they have a different character than those coming from above. Whereas the ultimate source of intuition is in the supermind, in the more accessible levels of the spiritual consciousness open to mankind, it operates in what he calls the intuition and also what he calls the intuitive mind. Whereas the supermind has an absolute and integral knowledge by identification with what is known, and the overmind has a universal and all-encompassing knowledge, the knowledge of the plane of intuition sees in flashes certain truths which are limited in their scope. Its knowledge, but within that scope of its knowledge is completely true. It is not merely a reflected knowledge like the ordinary mind, but it carries something of the substance and vibration of what it knows that arises from the supermind's knowledge by identity. It is a kind of limited action of the supermind knowledge, acting on the heights of the spiritual mind. Sri Aurobindo dissects the nature of this intuitive knowledge for us into 4 aspects. He says, the intuition proceeds wholly by 4 powers that shape the form of the truth. An intuition that suggests the idea, an intuition that discriminates, an inspiration that brings in its word and something of its greater substance, and 4th, a revelation that shapes to the sight its very face and body of reality. He explains that intuition is the disclosing of a knowledge that is secret but already existent in the being. It is not an acquisition, but something that was always there and revealable. The 2 lower powers of the suggestive idea and the discrimination work together to present to the mind the idea in its truth and its relation to other knowledge, as well as to distinguish it from potentially falsifying ideas coming from the ordinary levels of the mind. Its 2 higher powers are inspiration, which refers to an intuitive knowledge expressed in the form of the word and substance, and revelation, which refers to a kind of sight or vision of the intuitive truth that is experienced. Describing these 2 latter powers, Sri Aurobindo says, the inspiration is of the nature of truth hearing. It is an immediate reception of the very voice of the truth. It readily brings the word that perfectly embodies it, and it carries something more than the light of the idea. There is seized some stream of its inner reality and arriving movement of its substance. The revelation is of the nature of direct sight and makes evident to a present vision the thing in itself of which the idea is the representation. It brings out the very spirit and being and reality of the truth and makes it part of the consciousness and the experience. So together, these 2 higher powers bring the substance and vibration of the reality of the idea. And it is the combined working of the 4 powers together that brings the full intuitive knowledge. Sri Aurobindo explains that these 4 powers also operate at a higher level in the supermind itself, though there they operate, he says, with a fullness of body not modified by the mental stuff of the intelligence. Operating in the supermind, Sri Aurobindo describes the power of inspiration as a spiritual hearing and touch of the truth, of its essence, and through that, of its significance. That is to say, there is a seizing of its movement, vibration, rhythm, and a seizing of its close presence and contact and substance. In some of his correspondence with his disciples, Sri Aurobindo distinguishes between the true intuition and the intuitive mind, and mentions additional types of intuition. He says in one letter, intuition proper is true in itself when not interpreted or altered by mind, although fragmentary. Intuitive mind is mixed with mind and therefore not infallible, because the truth intuition gives may be mixed or imperfectly put by mind. He also says in another letter, there is the intuition, and below it there is the intuitive mind, which may have several degrees or layers. Also, there is a partial power of intuition in ordinary mind itself, in the vital, in the physical consciousness, in the material itself. And we can add this clarifying quote. The intuitive mind is a level of consciousness which is touched by the light of higher truths and receives them vividly and conveys them to the consciousness below. Regarding this intuitive mind, he explains, mental intuitive knowledge catches directly some aspect of a truth, but without any completeness or certitude, and the intuition is easily mixed with ordinary mental stuff that may be erroneous. In application, it may easily be a half-truth, or be so misinterpreted and misapplied as to become an error. Also, the mind easily imitates the intuition in such a way that it is difficult to distinguish between a true or a false intuition. Sri Aurobindo describes the normal action of the intuitive mind in people this way. The power of intuition acts in us at present, for the most part in a covert manner, secret and involved in or mostly veiled by the action of the reason and the normal intelligence. So far as it emerges into a clear separate action, it is still occasional, partial, fragmentary, and of an intermittent character. It casts a sudden light. It makes a luminous suggestion, or it throws out a solitary, brilliant clue, or scatters a small number of isolated or related intuitions, lustrous discriminations, inspirations, or revelations. And it leaves the reason, will, mental sense, or intelligence to do what each can or pleases with this seed of succor that has come to them from the depths or the heights of our being. The mental powers immediately proceed to lay hold on these things and to manipulate and utilize them for our mental or vital purposes. Yet it is through this intuitive mind, gradually purifying it of its mental intrusions and falsifications, that one ascends to the higher intuition and above towards the supermind. We will examine how to develop the intuition a little later in this talk, but here we can note this important guideline from Sri Aurobindo. The remedy is to train first the intellect to recognize the true intuition, to distinguish it from the false, and then to accustom it, when it arrives at an intellectual perception or conclusion, to attach no final value to it, but rather to look upward, refer all to the divine principle, and wait in as complete a silence as it can command for the light from above. In this way, it is possible to transmute a great part of our intellectual thinking into the luminous, truth-conscious vision. And from the side of the intuition, we can reiterate that one of the four powers of intuition mentioned earlier was discrimination. And one of its important functions is to discriminate between true intuitions and mental imitations or distortions. Distinguishing true intuitions from mental mixtures is a delicate task, requiring careful and extended self-training and experience. But a distinguishing feature of true intuitions is that they come directly without mental labor, and they carry with them a sense of certitude. I would like to turn now to discuss the higher possibilities of intuition. In Sri Aurobindo's interpretations of the Vedas, we get a perspective on the higher intuition as it was viewed by the ancient rishis. Here we find an emphasis on its power to lead us to the truth of the supermind. This significance comes out in Sri Aurobindo's translation and interpretation of one of the hymns of the Rig Veda, pertaining to the goddess Saraswati, who Sri Aurobindo associates with the power of intuition. Sri Aurobindo translates the final verse as follows: Saraswati awakens by the perceptive intelligence, the ocean, or flowing expanse, of Mahas, and governs diversely all the movements or all the faculties of the understanding. Sri Aurobindo translates or interprets this Mahas as the Vedantic principle of Vijnana, the instrument of pure truth and ideal knowledge, what Sri Aurobindo calls in his own writings the supermind. He then interprets the verse as follows: We can now understand the intention of the Rishi in his last verse and the greatness of the climax to which he has been leading us. Saraswati is able to give impulsion to truth and awaken to right thinking because she has access to the Maho Arnis, the great ocean. On that level of consciousness, we are usually, it must be remembered, asleep, shashupta. The Chaitana, or waking consciousness, has no access. It lies behind our active consciousness, is, as we might say, superconscious, for us, asleep. Saraswati brings it forward into active consciousness by means of the Ketu, or perceptive intelligence, that essential movement of mind which accepts and realizes whatever is presented to it. To focus this Ketu, this essential perception, on the higher truth by drawing it away from the haphazard disorder of sensory data is the great aim of yogic meditation. Saraswati, by fixing essential perception on the Satyam Ritam Brihat, what Sri Aurobindo translates as the truth, the right, the vast, and also this is, according to him, the Vedic conception of supermind, makes ideal knowledge active and is able to inform it with all those plentiful movements of mind which she has prepared for the service of the master of the sacrifice. She is able to govern all the movements and understanding without exception in their 1,000 diverse movements and give them the single impression of truth and right thinking. A governed and ordered activity of soul and mind, led by the truth-illumined intellect, is the aim of the sacrifice which the Rishi is offering to the gods. Sri Aurobindo's commentary on this hymn of the Rig Veda suggests that the true intuition and inspiration flow down from the supermental consciousness, bringing enlightenment to all the movements of the mind and soul. Sri Aurobindo discusses this higher intuition and its power of inspiration in his theory of the highest form of poetry, the mantra. He says in his book, The Future Poetry, the ancient poets of the Veda and Upanishads claim to be uttering the mantra because always it was this inmost and occult truth of things which they strove to see and hear and speak, and because they believe themselves to be using or finding its innate soul rhythms and the sacrificial speech of it cast up by the divine Agni, the sacred fire in the heart of man. The mantra, in other words, is a direct and most heightened and intensest and most divinely burdened rhythmic word, which embodies an intuitive and revelatory inspiration and ensouls the mind with the sight and the presence of the very self, the inmost reality of things, and with its truth, and with the divine soul forms of it, the Godheads, which are born from the living truth. Whereas mantra for Sri Aurobindo is the ideal poetry, he notes that it is a rare achievement. He explains in his book, Letters on Poetry and Art, that mantra is a word of power and light that comes from the overmind inspiration or from some very high plane of intuition. Its characteristics are a language that conveys infinitely more than the mere surface sense of the words seems to indicate. A rhythm that means even more than the language and is born out of the infinite and disappears into it. And the power to convey not merely the mental, vital, or physical contents or indications or values of the thing uttered, but its significance and figure in some fundamental and original consciousness, which is behind all these and greater. But ordinarily, the overmind inspiration does not come out pure in human poetry. It has to come down to an inferior consciousness and touch it, or else to lift it by a seizure and surprise from above into some infinite largeness. There is always a mixture of the two elements, not an absolute transformation, though the higher may sometimes dominate. You must remember that the overmind is a superhuman consciousness. However, the spiritual mind planes of intuition, illumined mind, and higher mind are more within the reach of human beings. And in his Letters on Poetry, Sri Aurobindo has discussed examples of inspired poetry from various poets coming from these levels, as well as from the inner mental and vital consciousness and the inmost psychic consciousness. Each region of the consciousness has in its expression its own characteristic vibration and substance. But it is also the case that inspirations from any of these levels may be seized on by the ordinary mind and lowered or deformed. So there is always the need for an inner discrimination to detect these distortions. Regarding the writing of his own epic poem, Savitri, Sri Aurobindo explains, the poem was originally written from a lower level, a mixture perhaps of the inner mind, psychic, poetic intelligence, sublimized vital. Afterwards, with the higher mind, often illumined and intuitivized, intervening. Most of the stuff of the first book is new, or else so altered as to be no more what it was. The best of the old has sometimes been kept almost intact because it had already the higher inspiration. Moreover, there have been made successive revisions, each trying to lift the general level higher and higher towards a possible overmind poetry. As it now stands, this was in November 1936, after which he worked on it for another 14 years. There is a general overmind influence, I believe, sometimes coming fully through, sometimes coloring the poetry of the other higher planes fused together, sometimes lifting any of these higher planes to its highest, or the psychic, poetic intelligence or vital towards them. We have these lines from Savitri expressing the reception of higher inspirations. Oft inspiration with her lightning feet, a sudden messenger from the all-seeing tops, traverse the soundless corridors of his mind, bringing her rhythmic sense of hidden things. A music spoke, transcending mortal speech. As if from a golden phial of the all-bliss, a joy of light, a joy of sudden sight, a rapture of the thrilled, undying word poured into his heart as into an empty cup. Another long passage about inspiration seems itself to express an overmind inspiration that reveals something of the substance and light of the realm of consciousness from which it comes. A few have dared the last supreme ascent and break through borders of blinding light above and feel a breath around of mightier air. Receive a vaster being's messages and bathe in its immense intuitive ray. On summit mind are radiant altitudes exposed to the luster of infinity. Outskirts and dependencies of the house of truth, upraised estates of mind and measureless. There man can visit, but there he cannot live. The cosmic thought spreads out its vastitudes. Its smallest parts are here philosophies, challenging with their detailed immensity, each figuring an omniscient scheme of things. But higher still can climb the ascending light. There are vasts of vision and eternal suns, oceans of an immortal luminousness, flame hills assaulting heaven with their peaks. There dwelling, all becomes a blaze of sight. A burning head of vision leads the mind. Thought trails behind it, its long comet tail. The heart glows and illuminate and sear, and sense is kindled into identity. The highest flight climbs to a deepest view. In a wide opening of its native sky, Intuition's lightnings range in a bright pack, hunting all hidden truths out of their lairs. Its fiery edge of seeing absolute cleaves into locked, unknown retreats of self, rummages the sky recesses of the brain, lights up the occult chambers of the heart. Its spear point ictus of discovery, pressed on the cover of name, the screen of form, strips bare the secret soul of all that is. Thought there has revelation's sun-bright eyes, the word, a mighty and inspiring voice, enters truth's inmost cabin of privacy and tears away the veil from God and life. Then stretches the boundless finite's last expanse, the cosmic empire of the overmind, time's buffer state, bordering eternity, too vast for the experience of man's soul. To establish a connection with the higher spiritual consciousness, to set a higher inspiration flowing, requires a great deal of preliminary purification and preparation of the nature. Sri Aurobindo lays out a discipline that can achieve this in his Integralyoga, but it requires a long and concentrated work on oneself, of which the essence is the sincere self-giving and surrender to the Divine Mother, the divine force, which alone can effect this great aim for us. The Integralyoga is a many-sided endeavor beyond the scope of this presentation, but I would like to outline several basic principles, focusing on those especially pertinent to the development of the intuitive mind and the higher intuition. In the synthesis of yoga, in the part of the yoga called the Yoga of Self-Perfection, Sri Aurobindo highlights the importance of the purification of the mind to receive intuitions undistorted. He explains that to rid the prana of desire, and incidentally to reverse the ordinary poise of our nature and turn the vital being from a troublesomely dominant power into the obedient instrument of a free and unattached mind, is then the first step in purification. He adds that once this dominance of the vital desires over the mind is corrected, then the purification of the mind from the intrusion of mental errors and distortions can more easily follow. One of the principal means for the purification of both the mind and the vital is the development of equality, the spiritual equivalent of what in ordinary context is called equanimity. There are several chapters devoted to this important condition in the synthesis of yoga, but here a brief description of it must suffice. Sri Aurobindo sums up its essence and in an extraordinary sentence in his letters on yoga. He says, equality means a quiet and unmoved mind and vital. It means not to be touched or disturbed by things that happen or things said or done to you, but to look at them with a straight look, free from the distortions created by personal feeling, and to try to understand what is behind them, why they happen, what is to be learned from them, what is it in oneself which they are cast against, and what inner profit or progress one can make of them. It means self-mastery over the vital movements, anger and sensitiveness and pride, as well as desire and the rest. Not to let them get hold of the emotional being and disturb the inner peace. Not to speak and act in the rush and impulsion of these things. Always to act and speak out of a calm inner poise of the spirit. Sri Aurobindo adds that whereas it is difficult to achieve this kind of equality in its fullness, we should always try more and more to make it the basis of one's inner state and outer movements. Its importance for the development of intuition and inspiration is that the consciousness must be pure and limpid, free from potentially distorting influences, so that the higher knowledge descending from above may be received in its native truth and power. Sri Aurobindo discusses 3 different approaches towards achieving equality: endurance, indifference, and submission. He says, the principle of endurance relies on the strength of the spirit within us to bear all the contacts, impacts, suggestions of this phenomenal nature that besieges us on every side without being overborne by them. Instead of seeking to protect itself from or to shun and escape the unpleasant impacts, it may confront them and teach itself to suffer from or to shun and escape and to bear them with perseverance, with fortitude, an increasing equanimity, or an austere or calm acceptance. Regarding the way of indifference, Sri Aurobindo says, it is an attitude which regards these passions of the mind as things born of the illusion of the outward mentality, or inferior movements unworthy of the calm truth of the single and equal spirit, or a vital and emotional disturbance to be rejected by the tranquil observing will and dispassionate intelligence of the sage. The third way of submission, he says, may be the Christian resignation founded on submission to the will of God, or an unegoistic acceptance of things and happenings as a manifestation of the universal will in time, or a complete surrender of the person to the divine, to the Supreme Purusha. He explains that all 3 approaches lead to an inhibition of the normal reactions of the mind to the touches of outward things. And secondly, to a separation of the self or spirit from the outward action of nature. Sri Aurobindo describes each of these approaches in some detail and goes on to explain other ways of developing equality. But for the present purposes, this gives a sense of some of the preliminary work necessary to develop the intuitive mind and inspiration. Sri Aurobindo describes 4 lines of progress towards developing the intuition and replacing by its action the normal mentality, which he says the divine Shakti uses in effecting this change within us. The first method is to silence the mind altogether, to silence the intellect, the mental and personal will, the desire mind, and the mind of emotions and sensations, and to allow in that perfect silence the self, the spirit, the divine, to disclose himself and leave him to illuminate the being by the supramental light and power and Ananda. In his letters on yoga, Sri Aurobindo has described 3 different but related methods for doing this. One is to stand back from the thoughts and observe them and the nature of the mind, but give no sanction to the thoughts and allow them to run down until they stop. The second method is to stand back from the thoughts as a disinterested witness, as if they are not one's own, and in which one takes no interest. He says that then, gradually, the mind divides into 2 parts. A calm witness part of the mind, and a part of the mind in which the thoughts cross or wander. From this poise, he explains, one can proceed to silence the active part of the mind also. And the third method is to see the thoughts as if they were coming from outside the head, as it were, and then, before they enter, to throw them away. He has suggested that this is the most powerful of the methods, and it's the one that he himself used and was able to silence his mind in a matter of 3 days. The second approach towards developing the intuition, the first being silencing the mind, the second is to reject the normal action of the intellect and instead to listen for the voice. Wait for the impulsion or the command, the adesha. Obey only the idea and will and power of the Lord within them, the divine self and Purusha in the heart of the creature. He explains that this leads to the experience of the Purusha in the heart and is the way most natural to those who have an emphasis on bhakti. This Purusha in the heart is the psychic being. In the Life Divine, we get a very concise statement about how to unveil the psychic being. Though it should be added, it's easier said than done. The method of detachment from the insistence of all mental and vital and physical claims and calls and impulsions. A concentration in the heart, austerity, self-purification and rejection of the old mind movements and life movements, rejection of the ego of desire, rejection of false needs and false habits are all useful aids to this difficult passage. But the strongest, most central way is to found all such and other methods on a self-offering and surrender of ourselves and of our parts of nature to the divine being, the Ishvara. A strict obedience to the wise and intuitive leading of a guide is also normal and necessary for all but a few especially gifted seekers. Sri Aurobindo explains in another long sentence what the unveiling of the psychic being brings. A guidance, a governance begins from within, which exposes every movement to the light of truth, repels what is false, obscure, opposed to the divine realization. Every region of the being, every nook and corner of it, every movement, formation, direction, disposition, propensity, desire, habit of the conscious or subconscious physical, even the most concealed, camouflaged, mute, recondite, is lighted up with the unerring psychic light. Their confusions dissipated, their tangles untangled, their obscurities, deceptions, self-deceptions, precisely indicated and removed. All is purified, set right, the whole nature harmonized, modulated in the psychic key, put in spiritual order. Sri Aurobindo explains that this Purusha in the heart is also intuitive and spiritual in its nature, and we can see from this description what a tremendous help it would be in quieting the mind and the vital nature and their disturbances. But by itself, it does not open to the highest intuitions and inspirations coming from the supermind. For that, a third approach towards developing the intuition is necessary. The third approach is to refer all our thought and action to the veiled truth of the divinity above the mind, and to receive all by a sort of descent from above, a descent of which we become not only spiritually but physically conscious. Sri Aurobindo explains that for this to reach completeness, it is necessary that we lift the center of thought and conscious action above the physical brain and feel it going on in the subtle body above. He explains that the lower activity of the mind will still come, but from this poise it is easier to achieve the intuitive discrimination that distinguishes the true intuitions from the lower mental mixtures. The ascent and opening of the consciousness to the higher consciousness above, and the reception of its higher intuitive knowledge and promptings, is what Sri Aurobindo calls elsewhere the spiritual transformation. It is described in some detail in the Life Divine in the chapter, The Triple Transformation. He explains there that the psychic change, which was described previously, prepares this movement of going above, but that in some cases it may come on its own without that psychic preparation, either because of a strong aspiration and concentrated effort, or due to some natural opening. Without the psychic purification of the nature, this opening may be attended by certain dangers and difficulties, because its effects can be very powerful, and they could be seized upon by the unpurified vital or mental ego. Sri Aurobindo explains what happens as a result of this opening of the consciousness upwards above the mind. If the rift in the lid of mind is made, what happens is an opening of vision to something above us, or a rising up towards it, or a descent of its powers into our being. What we see by the opening of vision is an infinity above us, an eternal presence, or an infinite existence, an infinity of consciousness, an infinity of bliss, a boundless self, a boundless light, a boundless power, a boundless ecstasy. He explains that at first there may be occasional experiences of this higher consciousness, from which we return back into the normal consciousness. But then repeated ascensions into it become easier and easier. Afterwards, there can come a permanent ascension into this realm. he describes this. The mind rises into a higher plane of pure self, silent, tranquil, illimitable. Or it rises into regions of light or of felicity, or into planes where it feels an infinite power or a divine presence, or experiences the contact of a divine love or beauty, or the atmosphere of a wider and greater luminous knowledge. The fourth approach to developing the intuition is to develop our intellect instead of eliminating it, but with the will not to cherish its limitations, but to heighten its capacity, light, intensity, degree, and force of activity until it borders on the thing that transcends it and can easily be taken up and transformed into that higher conscious action. Sri Aurobindo explains that this approach is in line with the aspect of the yoga of self-perfection in which all the instruments of the nature, the body, the life energies, the emotions, and the mind, are all raised to their highest possibilities and natural possible perfection, and then transformed by the action of the supramental consciousness into their supramental equivalents. This possibility is based on the basic truth that in the course of the evolution, this lower nature is not to be discarded, but to be perfected, transformed, and divinized. Sri Aurobindo explains that the divine Shakti typically utilizes all these four methods freely and flexibly according to the needs of its work and the demands of the nature, leading to the development of intuition and the higher levels of consciousness. I would like to conclude this discussion concerning the development of intuition and inspiration by noting an interesting conversation of the mother on the topic. In that discussion, she mentions several types of inspiration and methods for developing them. And then she mentions this important suggestion. She says, in the ordinary functioning of the brain, intuition is something which suddenly falls like a drop of light. If one has the faculty, the beginning of a faculty of mental vision, it gives the impression of something coming from outside or above, like a little impact of a drop of light in the brain, absolutely independent of all reasoning. Active thought must be stopped as far as possible, and the entire mental faculty must form at the top of the head and a little further above, if possible, a kind of mirror, very quiet, very still, turned upwards in silent, very concentrated attention. If you succeed, you can, or perhaps not immediately, but you can have the perception of the drops of light falling upon the mirror from a still unknown region and expressing themselves as a conscious thought, which has no connection with all the rest of your thought, since you have been able to keep it silent. That is the real beginning of the intellectual intuition. And finally, I will mention again that Sri Aurobindo encouraged some of his disciples who had a turn towards it to write poetry as a means for developing inspiration and the intuitive consciousness. Turning the consciousness within with the aspiration to receive inspirations from the higher levels of consciousness for the writing of poetry strengthens the passage to the higher consciousness and facilitates both the ascent of consciousness to these levels and the descent of their light and power and ananda into the mind and the lower consciousness. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.